He would teach the children and the adults the way of Christ. He did not put away all of his Oglala tools. He did not put away his pipe and his drum. He used them a whole lot less. He looked at them in a different way through a Christian lens, through the lens of the sacraments. But he was responsible for hundreds of conversions to the faith, and he was responsible, just as importantly, for bringing up people in the faith, teaching people in the faith to understand who they were as Christians, and in this context, who they were as Catholics.
Well, hey everyone, what is up? Welcome back to my channel. My name is Austin, and this is Gospel Simplicity, a place where we seek to bring simplicity out of theological complexity. Today we have a really fun conversation. We're jumping back into a series here on the channel called Christians You Should Know, often exploring people that maybe you haven't heard of. And today we're talking about Nicholas Black Elk, a Native American turned Catholic while still Native American, and we talk about that kind of tension that he inhabits of living inside those two worlds. And recently his cause for canonization has been opened, so who knows, maybe one day the title of this video will have to be changed to Saint Nicholas Black Elk. But I really hope you enjoy the video. It's a really interesting conversation from the point of history and culture and just what it means to be a faithful Christian where God has planted you. So I think you'll really enjoy it. I'm joined by Jon Sweeney, who's a fantastic author, written over 40 books. You'll really love his stuff if you want to check it out. But I want to say real quick before we get started, a huge thank you to my patrons, subscribers, and merch buyers who make this channel possible, especially to my patrons who out of their great generosity give monthly to support this channel. Man, thank you all so much. I know you won't see this because you watch these videos early and without ads, but I'm so grateful to all those people. And if you'd like to support the channel, you can go to patreon.com/gospelsimplicity, or if you want to make a one-time donation, you can go to paypal.me/gospelsimplicity. Well, with all that being said, I hope you guys enjoy the interview, and here it is. Today I am joined by Jon M. Sweeney. Jon M. Sweeney is an independent scholar and author of history, spirituality, poetry, mysticism, memoir, and young reader fiction. He's a popular interpreter of the life and work of Francis of Assisi and author of more than 40 books, including St. Francis of Assisi, with a foreword by Richard Rohr, and The Complete Francis of Assisi, used by Third Order Franciscans everywhere. HBO optioned the film rights to Sweeney's book on the medieval Pope Celestine V, The Pope Who Quit. He is also the author of the recent book, Nicholas Black Elk, Medicine Man, Catechist, Saint, which we'll be discussing today. Jon, thanks so much for being here today.
Thanks, Austin. It's good to be with you.
Well, it is a pleasure to have you on the channel today. I'm really excited for this conversation on Nicholas Black Elk. He's someone that I hadn't heard of until very recently, but I think his story is just so interesting. And I'd love to know, how did you get interested in writing on Nicholas?
Well, as your introduction suggested, I've written a lot of books, and it's something I've been doing for a long time, but I've also just written a lot of books. And what that suggests is that there's a lot of things that interest me. I'm drawn to a good story. I'm drawn to good stories that involve Catholic figures because I am myself a Catholic convert. So I think stories of Catholic converts draw me. And Nicholas Black Elk is a great story. I mean, it's I had read Black Elk Speaks. I mean, along with millions of other people, I read Black Elk Speaks back in college. It was a international best-selling book in the 1960s. It was published decades earlier, but I wasn't in college in the 60s. But I mean, I'm just saying, I'm not unique in having read Black Elk Speaks in college. I think a lot of people do and still do. And so I knew about this dramatic and passionate story. But I also knew that there was a big piece of his story that is not told in Black Elk Speaks. And so I was happy to accept the idea of writing his biography. It was a project that I undertook for a publisher who publishes short biographies of Catholic figures in the modern era, Catholic figures who have been very important in the modern era. So I was delighted to take it on, even though it's a little bit outside of what I had done in the past, because much of what I've done in the past involves medieval figures. But in this case, I had a great story to tell.
That's awesome. And it came out really well. And it's interesting that you say that as well. I think I first came across your work through, you edited, I believe Gardner's book on Catherine of Siena and read that.
Oh,
And then,
oh, oh. Well, you found one of the ones that not many people read.
well, there you go. There you go. Points for that. Well, I enjoyed it for what that's worth. But this book on Nicholas Black Elk was really interesting as well. And you mentioned already kind of the one picture that's been given of him in Black Elk Speaks, and then you kind of sought to give a more full-orbed picture of him. And from my understanding, he's a bit of a controversial figure, confounding both Catholics and Native Americans at once. Could you explain a bit of how his identity as Native American, Lakota, and Catholic has led to some controversy in how he's remembered and interpreted?
Well, what I say in the biography is that he baffles two communities. He baffles both communities because even though there are a lot of Native American and Oglala Sioux converts to Catholicism, there are a lot. The presence, the Catholic presence, and the Protestant presence, the Christian presence on the reservations has been long and lasting, and in some ways positive. I mean, in a lot of ways negative, but in some ways positive. And there are a lot of converts to Catholicism among Black Elk's people, including among his own family. But there also are a lot of folks who question whether or not the conversion was authentic, even among Black Elk's family. Even his own family is divided. Of course, a lot of us can understand having divided families. So there are some among Black Elk's descendants who say that the conversion was absolutely authentic and that we should trust what Black Elk had to say at the end of his life when he made very clear that he was a Catholic catechist and a convert of great passion and interest, and that he had found the truth when he found Christ. But then there are other members of his own family who have suggested and have outright claimed that the conversion to Christianity and to Catholicism was something that an Indian did in order to get along in a white man's world. So that's the way in which he baffles the Native community. And then he baffles the Christian community and the Catholic community because it's hard for Christians to understand still, then and still, how it's possible to maintain what is often called dual belonging. Two ways of being faithful to a tradition, including spiritual and religious traditions, because there are many ways in which Nicholas Black Elk remained very much an Oglala Sioux, even a medicine man, after he became a committed Catholic missionary and catechist. And there are folks in the church who will say, that's not possible. You have to renounce the one in order to become the other. But I think the life of Nicholas Black Elk shows that that's not necessarily true. I think also, this is also, I guess, part of my honest answer to that first question. It just occurs to me, is that part of my reason of being interested in this project is that I'm very interested in this subject of dual belonging. Not because I necessarily dual belong, but I am involved in an interfaith marriage. And so I'm married to a Jewish woman, and I would never for a second claim that I am Jewish as well as Christian. I don't claim dual belonging in my own life, but yet I know a lot of people who do, and I understand certainly dual belonging in the sense of sort of dual membership. I mean, I am not only married to a Jewish woman, but she's also a rabbi. So I'm actually a clergy spouse. So I'm very involved in a synagogue community, very actively and willingly and happily involved in a synagogue community, even though, I'm the Catholic guy who's married to the rabbi. But that dual belonging isn't necessarily about my existential being or my soul. Sometimes it's just simply about my congregational involvement, and mine happens to be dual belonging in that sense as well. So anyway, that's a rambling long answer to your question, but it gets at those various aspects.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that answer. And it's always neat to see how personal connections can inspire works and even just kind of shape our interests. And that's really neat to have that background there as well. So I appreciate you sharing that. And I think it's a conversation that whether people feel it in their own life, that sense of dual belonging, it's something that's really, especially in Catholic circles ever since Vatican II, has been a real big topic of conversation of how do we kind of make sense of a globalized world. And I think this is an interesting case study, maybe not in globalization, but in colonialization and all of those things. So I really enjoyed the work. I think it has a lot to offer people, not only for his great life, but also in these bigger conversations. But to jump back into your book, you divide it into three parts: medicine man, catechist, and saint. And that seems like as good a division to structure the interview as any, so that's what we'll do. But can we begin by just getting a little bit of background on his early life and maybe the status of Native Americans at this time for those that aren't super familiar?
Oh, sure. I mean, this was the the years of Black Elk's life are the years that really chronicle the real sadness of Native American life in on the North American continent, where white people stole their land and made promises and broke those promises over and over and over and pushed them farther and farther west with expansion and manifest destiny and all those things that we all learn about in social studies in high school. But I mean, it was the era of immigration where whites or Euro-American settlers began to explore and claim those lands um, during the founding of the American colonies and then beyond the founding of the states as they moved west. It was that manifest destiny, that idea. I mean, it was actually this feeling of, it was widely believed that unless a people were Christian, they were unfit to inhabit the new world. I mean, this was kind of a Puritan notion. It was a Christian notion that was very common, almost universally common among people in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s. It was also, the period of land grabs. I mean, a lot of people have heard about the Trail of Tears, where the Indians in the southeastern United States were forced to go west until they crossed the Mississippi River, and they ended up in places like Oklahoma. We've heard and people know about the discovery of gold in 1858 at Pikes Peak, and then in various other territories in those areas west of the Mississippi. And each time gold was discovered, there was a flood of new white settlers pouring in, and then there was new and fresh conflict between whites and Native Americans. It was also a time of great economic depression flowing throughout all of those decades. It was the growth of the railroads, which also fueled the pushing of whites and made it very easy for whites to get west as far as California. And so every time this would happen and the settlers would come, there would be fresh conflicts with Native Americans and more arguments all the way back in Washington and Philadelphia and Boston and New York for why they needed to be further sequestered and marginalized. And so there were more broken treaties and so on. So I mean, it was this whole story from like the 1860s until the 1930s, when Nicholas Black Elk was active, alive and active, that we see his life. And so when he tells his story in Black Elk Speaks, which was published in the 1930s while Black Elk was still alive, it is the story of the degradation and the marginalizing of Native American life and community, and the dramatic loss of the beauty of that life and their independence, as told through the very sort of sad eyes of this figure, Black Elk.
Thanks for that background. I think that's really going to help people kind of situate this whole conversation and understand what's going on, because in order to understand him as a figure, I think you really have to understand the cultural tides at this moment and the pressures on his dual identity, and the way that he was able to maintain that, I think, is particularly impressive in a time that was so difficult for Native Americans in this country. You cite two key events in Black Elk's early life as very formative, and these are Little Bighorn and the other is the slaughter at Wounded Knee. Could you kind of briefly walk us through why those are so important in understanding him?
Absolutely. First of all, he was born probably in 1866. So, I mean, I mentioned the 1860s, but just so people have the chronology there. And of course, the Civil War ended a year earlier. So it was also a period of time that was full of that kind of pain and memory. Um, he he was in these two key, I mean, one's a battle and one's a massacre. And they are sort of bookends of Native American life in the South Dakota, Montana, South Dakota, North Dakota, Montana sort of territories in particular. The first was the Battle of Little Bighorn, which was in June 1876, and Nicholas Black Elk is only 10 years old at that battle. But he was there, and his cousin, Crazy Horse, who's one of these charismatic figures who goes in and out of all of these events and these stories, he's one of the many charismatic Native American figures at this time, along with people like Red Cloud and others, was the hero of the day. And what we, Euro-American white folks who study these things in high school in our predominantly, white schools learn is that this was the battle in which Lieutenant Colonel George Custer fell and died. And that's the narrative that not only that we were probably taught when we were in school, but it's the narrative ever since that day in June of 1876. It was, it was the time when Native Americans were vilified for having killed such a great leader as Lieutenant Colonel Custer. Of course, they were simply defending their land. They were simply defending their sovereignty, and they were also responding to some of those things that I talked about a minute ago. I mean, the treaties that had been broken, and the violence that had been wrought on their communities, and the way in which they had been marginalized and forced to not only give up their land, but to start living like whites. And they had to carve out little pieces of land, and they had to learn to farm, and they were unable to ride on horseback, and they were unable to hunt buffalo, and their whole way of life was destroyed. So I mean, they were defending themselves. So it was a great victory for the native community. And one interesting fact is that Nicholas Black Elk that day actually was involved. He was involved in the battle itself. I mean, he was involved in killing 3 men, for instance. So, for instance, when you fast forward today, and we'll get to this, I imagine, in our conversation, but when you fast forward today, where in the Roman Catholic Church, Nicholas Black Elk is now being considered for sainthood, there aren't many saints who have a history of killing people. I mean, there are a couple others that are sort of interesting to imagine, but I was asking a Jesuit scholar recently if we could be fairly certain that St. Ignatius of Loyola, for instance, had been involved because he was involved in some serious fighting, some serious battles. I imagine he must have killed somebody in one of those, but we don't have him confessing as much anyway. So Nicholas Black Elk actually was involved in killing 3 men that day as a 10-year-old. I mean, imagine that, as a 10-year-old. So then the bookend at the other end that I mentioned was, and as you mentioned, was the massacre at Wounded Knee. So the massacre at Wounded Knee comes much later. By that point, it was a massacre. It wasn't a battle. It was sort of a setup by the white armies who were still angry 20 years later after the battle at Little Bighorn. And they basically rounded up Oglala Sioux and a few other native folks who were gathered at Wounded Knee and shot them and massacred them. And Nicholas Black Elk is a witness to that event. He wasn't involved in fighting. There was actually very little active fighting. It was all one-sided, but he was a witness to that event. And that is an event that really brings a closure in many ways, in almost every major respect, to Native American life on the Great Plains, any hint of the possibility of Native American true sovereignty or freedom.
Yeah, that's really helpful to see him as both involved in that early battle at 10 years old. Like you said, I cannot imagine that. And from an academic standpoint, it is fascinating to think about the canonization process and what that means for him as far as amongst other saints. But then, yeah, that massacre there, I think that can't help but leave incredibly just deep scars on you and shape how you're going to see the world throughout the rest of your life. And I think if there's been a bit of a change in tide slowly in how we as kind of white Euro-Americans look at these things. I think at one point we really pushed kind of the manifest destiny, and in some ways still do, but I think there's been a flip, kind of an attempt to correct that by vilifying everything that Christians did amongst Native American groups. And so I think in order to understand this man who really inhabits the tensions of both of those identities, as I think I put in the outline, it would almost be, I forget how I put it, but you can't have a conversation about this. It would be unwise to not talk about colonization in some way. But you have this great quote that I think in your book kind of gets at the tension of how do we make sense of Christian interaction with Native Americans and its beauty and its rampant ugliness in many places. You're right. It is usually assumed in our popular culture and classrooms that Christianity has been nothing but an upsetting force to Native American ritual, religion, and life since missionaries first introduced Christianity to indigenous people. You go on, but we have such a hard time seeing Nicholas Black Elk for who he was if we cannot see beyond the mold of this common understanding. So this could very well be a conversation on its own. However, could you comment on this a bit further, helping us see how we can simultaneously recognize the incredibly negative things done by Christians in Native American communities while not allowing that to be all we see in looking at someone like Nicholas Black Elk? Hey, we'll be right back to the interview, but first I want to tell you about another sponsor for today, and that is Faithful Counseling. Faithful Counseling is a group of Christian counselors that exist to help you get the help you need. You know, one of the first YouTube videos I ever made was called You Can Have Jesus and a Therapist Too. And what I wanted to do in that video was draw out the fact that so many people are struggling with mental health, and the last thing we want to do is make it more difficult for people to reach out to get the help they need by creating this stigma around it. It's something that I'm really passionate about and think we need to end in Christian circles. And that's why I'm so excited to be partnering with Faithful Counseling. Their counselors all will be counseling from a Christian perspective, and you can connect with them from any country in the world. They have counselors that speak many different languages. And hey, if it's important to you to have a counselor from your specific tradition or background, they can do their part to try to pair you up with one of them as well. All of their counselors are licensed with over 3,000 hours of experience. You can connect with these counselors in a variety of ways. In fact, you can do video sessions, phone calls, live chat, or messaging. All of the messaging is secure, and if it's between scheduled sessions, you'll receive a response within 24 to 48 hours. If this is interesting to you, if you think this would be helpful for you or maybe a loved one, I'd encourage you to go to faithfulcounseling.com/gospelsimplicity. If you do that, first of all, you'll get 10% off your order, and you will be matched with a counselor in less than 24 hours. Again, that's faithfulcounseling.com/gospelsimplicity to be matched with a counselor in less than 24 hours and get 10% off your first month. Faithful Counseling costs $260 per month, which gets you unlimited messaging with your counselor in 4 30-minute sessions. But again, if you go to faithfulcounseling.com/gospelsimplicity, you'll get 10% off that first month. Lastly, Faithful Counseling is not a crisis line. If you are currently experiencing suicidal thoughts or ideation, please reach out to a crisis line or hotline. You can find one of them at www.crisistextline.org. Please do so and reach out. You do not have to do this alone. Well, thank you all so much, and I will let you get back to the video, but if you want to check them out, again, faithfulcounseling.com/gospelsimplicity. The link is in my bio and in the pinned comment. Well, back to the interview.
Yeah, thank you. I do think you have to begin with the negative things. I mean, I think you did that, but I mean, I almost feel like I have to repeat it. You know, I am in favor of not lionizing Christopher Columbus anymore, the way we did when I was a child. I mean, I was a child a lot longer ago than you were, but when I was a kid, we would lionize Christopher Columbus for founding the New World, and I think it's a good thing that we have unlearned that fact. Columbus also said some awful things in his letters and in his diary about the Native American people, about natives generally. And I'm glad that we have been able to recognize these as awful things. As I mentioned, I think I mentioned that part of Manifest Destiny, which was also part of the missionary impulse, was this belief that was widely held that unless you were Christian, you weren't fit to inhabit the New World. that's a deeply offensive belief and teaching. And it was a teaching that was perpetuated by Christian missionaries. And again, you know what? Now I realize this is another reason why I was drawn to the project in the first place. Going back to your first question, is that I was a missionary once myself. When I was very young, when I was 19 years old, I was a missionary for a time. And I felt that the way in which I was a missionary was inappropriate. And I think there are a lot of missionaries today. In fact, I know there are a lot of missionaries today who are not inappropriately on the mission field, who are involved in missions that do good for the people that they are there to serve, and that they aren't there with as much a converting impulse as with a servant impulse. And I respect that. And I think that's part of the distinction and the clarification that maybe you're looking for. But that's a slim piece of the whole of our history with Native communities. And, you know, it cuts across denominational divides. I mean, it was a pope in 1452 who promulgated a bull, you know, an encyclical, an official pronouncement of the Roman Catholic Church that the slave trade was legitimate, and then paved the way for people like Columbus and the Portuguese and Spanish empires to go and make slaves of peoples all over North and South America. But Nicholas Black Elk's story is one of those stories that does hit the sort of cross section of being a missionary and this mission impulse, in that there's a heck of a lot of good that is also done by missionaries both then and now. His life story itself is kind of interesting in this respect, because his own conversion to Catholicism was brought about by an obnoxious event involving a missionary, involving a Jesuit priest, which, you know, maybe we'll get to. Really quite obnoxious by any standard, sort of moral or, you know, human or religious. But yet it's almost as if Black Elk was wise enough to see past the sort of inappropriateness of the personal exchange that they had, and to see some greater truth and purpose for his life. And he then went and studied with that same missionary who had been obnoxious to him, and fairly quickly then became a Catholic, and, as I've said a couple of times, became a catechist. A catechist meaning a teacher of the faith, and an extraordinary one then for decades. So he saw that there was something that Christ and the church and in his case, in his Catholic environment, the sacraments, would be good for himself, or his family, and for his people. And he was right. You know, I mean, so at the same time, I mean, just it's like you have to hold the tension together. So there was this awful way in which, of course, you know, in the news for the last even just couple of years, it's still in the news, particularly in Canada recently, the way in which Catholic schools destroyed so many Native children. At the same time, there are many good things that Catholic schools have done for Native children. It's just that you can't possibly say the latter without highlighting the former.
That's a really good way of putting it right there at the end. You can't possibly say the latter without saying the former. And I think we have this tendency in all things of, we don't like tension. So we want one narrative to kind of win out over the other. Either it's all this or it's all that, because that kind of eases our cognitive dissonance in a lot of ways. It's difficult to hold both of those things, but I think, to be historically fair, we have to hold both of them. And like you said, I think we have to start with the negative things done, because not only are they so ugly, but also as Christians, I think, to recognize that, like, we have to own these things, that, hey, we should have this even higher expectation of how these interactions should have gone. And it's something that should unsettle us, that in the name of Christ, people were treated so poorly. And so I appreciate the way that you put that there. So with all of this in mind, you began to kind of start hinting at it there, but I'd like to jump into it a bit more, if you don't mind, of the idea of how Nicholas Black Elk became Catholic. Because like you said, it's an interesting story. And what does that look like for him at his time?
Well, it's important to point out that he had friends and family who were already Catholic, who had already joined the church. So there's this way in which he resisted it for quite a while. That's part of the story, I think, of what happened with him in his life. He had been married before to a Catholic convert woman. She died. When he married again, he married another Catholic woman. But his own conversion didn't come until 1904. And again, he was born in 1866. So you get a sense, this is a more than middle-aged, certainly by the standards of the day, a more than middle-aged man. Probably a man who felt that he was probably in the last sort of circle of life. And that event that I was referring to that involved an obnoxious missionary was that Nicholas Black Elk was at that time, actually it was just Black Elk at that time, he was called to the teepee of a family who had a very sick child who was unconscious and ill and in danger, and he was the medicine man who was called in to do religious ritual that was of a Oglala Sioux sort that he was well trained to do, and that his father and his grandfather had done and had known. At the same time, one of the Jesuit priests who were there in the community was called to the bedside as well. And the Jesuit priest comes upon Black Elk while he has out his pipe and his drum and his herbs and so on, and he's doing what a medicine man does by the boy's bedside. And the priest enters the teepee and throws Black Elk out. I mean, quite literally, the narrative is that it was actually physical. It was a physical confrontation in a way. Told him to get out, that he was, a force of darkness instead of a force of light. And surely they knew each other. I mean, there's no question that they knew each other already at that time. This was a small community, and I'm sure that the medicine man knew the local priests at that time, even before his own process of conversion began. So he was insulted, terribly insulted. I mean, just imagine, the sort of this was a cross-religious experience and interchange, and that's a deeply inappropriate response on any level. But it's a tribute, I think, to Black Elk's humility and his wisdom and various other qualities, that his response to this was not to express his outrage, but it was to follow the Jesuit back to the parish house and to begin over the next couple of weeks his own process of conversion, which is exactly what he did. And in fairly quick order, then he embraces Catholicism. Sort of point of fact that I think everybody should know is that his embracing of Catholicism involved his being baptized on December 6th, and this was 1904. So December 6th, if you think about what December 6th is, that is the feast of St. Nicholas of Myra, St. Nick. And that's the reason why he takes the name Nicholas Black Elk. And this is one of those little details that sometimes is missed by biographers of Black Elk who aren't sensitive to his Catholic background and formation.
Yeah, that's really interesting there, the feast day. And it is so interesting to see how he responded to this situation, which you rightly described as inappropriate there. And if I recall correctly, and I get this might be a little far afield from his conversion story, but it's just kind of an interesting thing. And I don't know if it would be another point that would come up in his canonization. But if I recall, he had technically already been baptized by an Episcopalian, correct? As part of the traveling circus, is that right? Am I remembering this correctly?
We don't know that absolutely for sure. I think you read that in my book. I've done a little more research on that point, actually, since the book came out, and we don't know for sure. I can't remember how I say it in my book. I think I say that he was supposed to have been baptized an Episcopalian in order to be a part of the Wild West show of Wild Bill Cody. That was supposed to be a requirement. And he probably was. There is no baptismal certificate. The historian wants some data, some proof of this. We have nothing. and we don't have sort of a testimony to the effect either. Uh, at the same time, I think it's very likely the tenor of the time would have been that nevertheless he probably would have been baptized again uh, when he was welcomed into the Catholic Church. So it's very likely that he was baptized twice. We wouldn't do it that way today. Today, if you were baptized as an infant, whether as an Episcopalian or as a Lutheran or whatever, and you were to join the Catholic Church and be welcomed in the Catholic Church and be confirmed, you would almost always, I mean, you are not supposed to be rebaptized. But I think the practice of the day back in 1904 was different. But we don't absolutely know for sure.
Okay. Gotcha. Yeah, that was just an interesting kind of passing point that I remembered there. So I wasn't sure, but granted that if that was the practice of the day, that doesn't seem that would be any hindrance to his canonization, which we'll get to shortly. But you mentioned that he accepted Catholicism pretty quickly, and I'm not sure if you would say this is the reason, but you do point out in the book that there's some intriguing overlaps between Lakota and Catholic religious structure and beliefs, and that if this didn't aid his conversion, it may have aided his catechesis and how he taught others at the time. Could you explain a bit of this?
Yeah, there's two pieces of it. One is there were a lot of missionaries in the native territories at this time. There were a lot of Protestant missionaries, and there were a lot of Catholic missionaries as well. And it's interesting to consider why it is that the Catholics, they were mostly Jesuits, were the ones who were, well, in missionary talk, were the most successful. In more just sort of human talk, were more welcomed by the Oglala Sioux people. And part of that is because the Jesuits, the Catholic missionaries, were willing and able to see Native American understanding of God as being very congenial to a Christian understanding of God. Whereas I mean, I'm generalizing, but whereas the Protestant missionaries more often would take the approach, which often happens in missionary communities, particularly in the past, I hope more than in the present, saying that everything must be stripped away, everything must be lost and taken away in order for you to accept what is a new, mantle of faith and salvation in Christ. That there is the old and then there is the new, as opposed to finding the overlaps, whether it's in language or in concept or in theological category and so on. But the Jesuits were very good at seeing that the Oglala approach to God and to God the Father and the God in heaven could very easily be adapted to understanding God the Father as the first person of the Christian Trinity and so on. So that's part of why I think the transition was not a difficult one, whereas it could have been a much more difficult one in the sort of other paradigm that I was alluding to. And then I think he was prepared for a fairly smooth transition because, as I mentioned, he had been married to a woman for years who was Catholic. He had children who were Catholic. He had just resisted it himself. And, again, we don't exactly know why. It's not like we have an abundance of data for this. We have interviews that he gave, but the interviews sometimes are sort of to be trusted and sometimes not. And that's something I talk about in my book. That's one of the difficulties of talking about Black Elk and dealing with Black Elk. And I also already alluded to the fact that even members of his own family take two different positions when they talk about, their father or their grandfather's history of faith and religious alliance and so on. But clearly he had been involved, surrounded by a Catholic environment in many ways. He knew what he was getting into. He knew what he was going to be accepting. He knew what he was going to be adapting in his own religious view by becoming a Catholic. And so for all of those reasons, the transition was a fairly smooth one. And he became, as I said, a catechist, a teacher of great renown and importance and effectiveness.
And I think that brings us a bit kind of full circle before we close out with the canonization process of we started with this tension and even his family and how he's to be remembered as both Oglala Sioux and Catholic. And how do those things meet, or do they not? Does one kind of hold out over the other? And as we've kind of gone through his story and now we're at the point where he is a catechist, could you describe a bit of what this looked like practically for him as this fully Catholic catechist sharing the faith very successfully with many people while also retaining his Native American identity?
Yeah. And to preface that, let me say, because I want to get at least make sure that we say this, that in a Native context, particularly, the most important event in Black Elk's life was the great vision that he had at the age of 9, which is the kind of event that happens in the life of someone who is going to be part of doing something great for his or her people. And this formed him. It was part of his inheritance as a medicine man, as a visionary within his community. And he carried this. This is a thread that he then carries throughout his life. It doesn't change from his being an Oglala Sioux medicine man to being a Catholic catechist. He has this great vision. That's what it's called, the great vision. He has this great vision at the age of 9, which is, by the way, the year before the Battle of Little Bighorn. So it's before that violent event. And he is told, he's taken in his vision to the top of the highest mountain, which he calls the center of the world as well. And he is told, it's a complicated vision, that there have been books written about just the vision itself. But he is told that he has a part to play, a significant part to play in bringing liberation, salvation, if you will, to his people. And he takes this very seriously. This is his inheritance. It's the mantle that he has to put on. Almost in the way of a king in the Old Testament. So then when he becomes a Catholic, it's absolutely assumed by him that he's not going to be, I guess, pardon the expression, just sort of a humble Catholic who goes to Mass or who raises a family, but he has a significant role to play. He still has this mantle that he's carrying. He is supposed to bring hope and, again, salvation, if you can think of the word broadly, to his people. And he does that by becoming a great catechist. And becoming a catechist meant basically riding around on horseback or walking long distances from community to community, carrying a bag full of tools to teach. He had catechisms. He had what were called picture catechisms at the time, which showed the road to salvation versus, the road to hell, essentially. He would teach the children and the adults the way of Christ. He did not put away all of his Oglala tools. He did not put away his pipe and his drum. He used them a whole lot less. He looked at them in a different way through a Christian lens, through the lens of the sacraments. But he was responsible for hundreds of conversions to the faith, and he was responsible, just as importantly, for bringing up people in the faith, teaching people in the faith to understand who they were as Christians, and in this context, who they were as Catholics. So, and he did this from the first decade of the 20th century, 1906, 1907, all the way through the 30s. In his last several years of life, he was relatively inactive because of lots of physical infirmities and so on. But he is held up, for instance, by Bishop Robert Barron, who is one of the Catholic authors that many people know today. He's held up as the truly exemplary catechist. And this has a lot to do with his cause for canonization.
Yeah, Robert Barron is no small voice, at least in the media world, to have behind your case for canonization. Of course, it takes more than just having Bishop Robert Barron, but I'm sure it doesn't hurt. But I would love to talk about that as kind of our final point today, and it's kind of where you end off your book, if I recall correctly, as Saint Nicholas Black Elk ? And so his case for canonization has been opened, and Where is that kind of at? And you talked a little bit about maybe some of the things that could hold that back, specifically the battles at age 10 and having killed 3 people. But what should people know about where it's at, and maybe what could people expect?
Well, the having killed a few people is not something I've ever seen anyone else suggest could hold back his cause for canonization. I just speculate on it because I think it's interesting. As someone who has studied a lot of saints and spent a lot of years and time writing books and studying saints, I don't know of other instances that fit that. But on the other hand, we have great stories of conversion, and I don't think there's anyone out there who says that someone can't go from the greatest sinner to becoming the greatest saint. So I just find that interesting to ponder myself. But I've never seen anyone sort of in the church or involved in causes of canonization suggest that would be a problem. The cause for canonization began in 2017, in October 2017. And this is also right when my interest in the story began, because I co-wrote with a friend of mine who's a Nicholas Black Elk scholar. His name is Damian Costello. And he was also one of the vice postulators of the cause for canonization. There's some big Catholic words for your watchers and listeners. Damien and I wrote this article together for a magazine called America Magazine about the cause for canonization. And it began in October 2017 when the descendants of Nicholas Black Elk brought a petition to then Bishop Gruss of the diocese of Rapid City. Sorry, I was trying to remember. The Diocese of Rapid City, which is now South Dakota. And then the way it happens is that then Bishop Gruss takes it to the United States Council of Conference of Catholic Bishops for a conversation and discussion. And then it moves forward to becoming a formal cause, as it's called, a formal cause of canonization. And then there's lots to do. I mean, the process, I don't know if people care about this, but the process is complicated. You have to read everything that the subject ever wrote. And this is part of what the vice postulators do, like my friend Damien. You read everything that they ever wrote. You investigate them, almost like you would do in a court of law. You investigate their life, their writings, their impact, and so on, their conversion, their sincerity. And then eventually you get to the point where you send the cause, as it's called, which is basically, imagine, a very large file folder of papers. You send the cause into the hands of a postulator. You go from those vice postulators to a postulator who carries it to Rome and champions the cause among the various committees and folks in Rome, and eventually it goes to the Pope. And none of this much matters, except I suppose to the very the Catholic who's paying close attention to such things, except that I think we all like having saints in some general way. But to Catholics who look to saints, it's something that is taken very seriously, and that's why the process is a serious one.
That's really interesting, and it's neat to get to hear some of the inner workings of that. And I think my audience, I say this with the most love possible, are true theology nerds, so I'm sure they loved every moment of that. And so, if I understand correctly, in that process, he's currently at the vice postulate level, or has it gone to Rome?
No, it has gone to Rome. It has
Oh,
been
okay.
sent. It has been sent by a postulator to Rome. So he is now servant of God, Nicholas Black Elk.
Okay.
He could never be declared a saint. He could never be declared a blessed, beatified. First comes beatified, in which case he would then be referred to as blessed Nicholas Black Elk, and then the next becomes Saint Nicholas Black Elk. That can never happen. Sometimes a cause for canonization just sits for hundreds of years. Sometimes it sits for 100 years, and then the subject is beatified. As I think people generally know, this involves the verification of a couple of miracles along the way. And what that means is quite literally that there's a verified, usually a physical healing, a verified miracle where the subject who is the subject of the miracle demonstrates having appealed to Nicholas Black Elk for intercession. One of the things that people often don't understand is that they think that Nicholas Black Elk healed me. It's not that Nicholas Black Elk healed me. It's that the person appealed to Nicholas Black Elk, pray for me, and then the person experiences some unexplained miracle of healing, and that is then verified through a very formal process of interviews and evidence.
It's fascinating how much goes into this, and I really appreciate how much goes into it, as it is a serious thing, and so that's just really neat to get to see behind the curtain there just a little bit. Well, I want to thank you so much for your time today. This has been a really fun conversation. I've greatly enjoyed it. And I want to wrap up with a little segment that we do here on the show called the Final Four. And it's just 4 kind of quick, one word, one sentence answers to some questions to let the listeners get to know the guests maybe on a bit more personal level, and get to sometimes peel back the academic layers that are sometimes over the conversations. So the first question is, what has been the most fruitful habit or spiritual discipline in your life?
Oh, the temptation is to lie, and to say something that would sound more pious. But I'm going to say, with again another great saint who I love, Saint Teresa of Avila, that the discipline that has been the most important in my life, there's no question, the discipline that I use daily in my life, is that a book in my hand leads me to prayer. Saint Teresa of Avila said as much, and that has been so true for me.
That's wonderful, and I can see plenty of them behind you there as evidence towards that. But I think you're in good company there with Saint Teresa of Avila. So there we go. All right, outside the Bible, and this is going to feed nicely off of that last question, what has been the most impactful book on your life?
That's almost impossible to answer, honestly. I think if I had to pick one, I'm sort of going back to a little book I've turned to over and over and over, and it really formed me in some sort of deep, hard to express ways, would be Tolstoy's 23 Tales. It's a little book, little short stories, folk tales by Leo Tolstoy.
Awesome. That's not one that's come up. I'll have to check that out. All right, so you're having coffee with your undergraduate self. What is one piece of advice you'd give him for his future in research and writing?
Take yourself seriously. Listen to what your passions are and follow them, even if it doesn't seem like you can see the future of where they will lead you.
That's great advice. That this channel, it's often pointed out that despite being named Gospel Simplicity, the conversations can get a bit complex, leading some people to ask me, will you change the channel to Gospel Complexity? And I tell them never. But in a sentence or so, what is the gospel?
I think the gospel is that it's good news. It's definitely good news that the world need not have a hold on you, and that God knows who you really are.
That's a great answer. Well, Jon, thank you so much for your time today, and thanks to all of you that watch this sometime in the future. I know I don't take your time lightly. I'll close as I always do by saying until next time, be on the lookout for more videos, but far more important than that, go out and love God and love others, because truly, above all else, that will change the world.